An estimated 1 million people every year visit Alaska by cruise ship. An estimated 2 million people every year end up sitting in front of their computers overwhelmed and frustrated trying to figure out when to go, which cruise line to go with, how long to go for, and how to piece this trip together. Hi, I'm Bob Bradley from the Pampered Cruiser, and if you're considering a cruise to Alaska or really any other river, ocean, or expedition cruise, then we'd love to help you out. Here's our contact information, and it's also in the notes below. Well, we put this presentation together because we found we were getting a lot of calls from people whose heads were getting ready to explode because they like the idea of getting to Alaska to enjoy its spectacular scenery, geography, wildlife, and whales. But when they began to dig into the details, it became more overwhelming than Lithuanian language lessons. There are just so many details and choices. This is a valid concern. All the cruise lines operate in Alaska, and if you include the land-sea packages, there's well over 1,000 different options to choose from. So if the idea of visiting coastal Alaska appeals to you, but you really don't know where to even begin to narrow down your choices, I'll lead you through 7 steps to choosing the right Alaska vacation for you, with a series of questions that quickly makes the best choice much more obvious. It would be nice if there were a right answer to the question, but the best cruise choice for you depends on a whole bunch of different factors, and the right answer for one person might be different for another. So we'll walk through the 7 simple questions, and when you're finished answering those, you'll be much closer to making the best decision for you. Let's jump in. Question number 1, do you want to visit Denali? It may seem strange that this is the very first question, but the answer to this will drive many of your other decisions. First, a bit of background on Denali. One of the big mistakes that people make when considering Alaska is not really understanding how big it is. Denali National Park is actually larger than Massachusetts, and it's about 8 hours from the cruise ship ports in Anchorage. So it's something that you have to plan as a key part of the trip. You can't just do it as a shore excursion off the ship. So the reason people want to see Denali? Well, it's North America's highest peak, and when you see photos of the big snow-capped volcano, it's probably quite likely that you're looking at Denali. The tours you can take in it at the Denali National Park itself is almost like doing a game drive in Africa with all the wildlife and the vast natural refuge there. One of the common bits of feedback that we get from people who've been to Alaska is that either Denali was a huge highlight for them, or if they didn't go, they'd heard from others and they'd wish they had. Coastal Alaska, what you'll see on the ship, is much different than the interior of Alaska and Denali National Park. They're both spectacular in their own way, but they're very different. So no matter where you live, Alaska is a long way away, and you should consider seeing as much as you can, especially if you don't think you're going to get back there. So figure out if Denali is part of your plans, and the answer to this question will immediately narrow your options in half. See, we've already made some progress. Question 2. How long can you be away? The shortest trip you can do to Alaska is 7 nights, and that's cruise only. That's without any time on land. Not unlike when you go to Europe, if you've invested the time and money to go that far, it makes sense to stay as long as your time and budget will allow. Trip extensions into Denali and the interior of Alaska range between 3 and 14 nights. But if you choose the 3-night land extension in Denali, you should expect to spend most of those 3 days on motor coaches. Again, Alaska is huge, and you're covering an awful lot of distance. The most common cruise extension is 5 nights, and most people choose this because of the huge distance you need to cover. And I should mention this doesn't count any time you might want to spend in Seattle or Vancouver pre or post trip. It's 2 hours from the ship to Anchorage and another 6 hours from Anchorage up to Denali. And then you have to get back to either Anchorage or Fairbanks to fly home. So make sure you allocate enough time to see everything you want to see and to be able to travel the distances once you get there. Number 3, northbound, southbound, or round trip. There are some round trip cruises out of Seattle or Vancouver, but you should consider that those cruises only get you halfway up the coast. They visit the Alaskan Panhandle, and the scenery in that part of Alaska is stunning, but you don't have the opportunity to visit Denali unless you fly up. To give you an idea of the scale of the distance we're talking about here, one of the bits of trivia I like to throw out to people is that if you board your ship in Vancouver, then when you're standing on the pier getting ready to board, you're actually closer to Mexico than you are to Anchorage. Alaska and British Columbia are that huge. If you decided in step 1 to go to Denali, then you can't go round trip from Seattle or Vancouver anyway. One end of your trip will have to be Anchorage or Fairbanks. So the very next question is whether or not to sail northbound or southbound. There's lots of opinions about this, but the short answer is it really makes very little difference, with one caveat. A one-way cruise means you'll be flying to or from Anchorage or Fairbanks at one end of your trip. And as we've been discussing, it's an awful long way. So to give you an idea, it's over 4 hours on a plane between Seattle and Anchorage or Fairbanks. So for most people in the United States, Seattle or Vancouver is only halfway. So keep in mind that the flight duration times and logistics will be longer at the Alaska end of your trip. And some people prefer to have that longer day of travel on their way to their vacation, and others would prefer it on their way home. The other thing to keep in mind is when you're on land in Alaska, you will be moving around a lot and you'll be packing and unpacking every night or every 2 nights, which of course is different than once you're on board the ship. You unpack once and it's a bit more of a, even though you'll be busy on the ship, it's a bit more of a leisurely pace. Finally, I should mention that regardless of which routing you pick, you're going to need a passport for any Alaskan cruise, even if you choose round trip out of Seattle. All cruises are required to make at least one foreign port stop, so you'll enter Canada at one point or another. Number 4, should I do Denali and the Alaska Interior pre or post cruise? Honestly, this question is a bit of an extension of question 3, and if you're going round trip out of Seattle or Vancouver or cruise only, you can skip this question. For everybody else, they'll agonize over whether Denali and the Interior should be visited pre or post cruise. In reality, this is largely a matter of personal preference that should probably be driven by 2 factors. One, the flight logistics that we were just talking about that are going to be much longer at the Alaska end of your trip. And 2, one of the advantages of being on a cruise ship is that you get to visit multiple locations and only unpack the ones. So when you're on land, you'll be in and out of hotels and lodges every night, and it's just a bit busier than when you're on the cruise. So figure out which one is best for you. Number 5, when to go. Contrary to some commentary, there is really no best time to visit Alaska, but rather a series of trade-offs that will lead you to the best decision for you. For the record, my own personal bias is for the late spring, say around the first couple of weeks of June, but others would disagree for a variety of very good reasons. The cruise ship season runs from mid-April through to October, and the temperature actually varies very little in that time, particularly in coastal Alaska. May and June are the driest months in the interior of Alaska, where the rain starts in August and runs through September and October. The other thing to keep in mind is that the days are longest towards the end of June, when the sun will set in Anchorage sometime after midnight and then reappear about 3 a.m. They don't technically get 24 hours of daylight, but with the twilight it doesn't really ever get completely dark at that time of year. If you're going to Alaska to see whales, then depending on the species, you'll be able to see them from May through September. Although anytime you're trying to predict nature, there is a high margin of error. Orcas are usually seen most in May and June, while humpback whales can be seen right through the entire cruise ship season. You'll find Alaskan cruises are typically cheaper earlier and later in the season, but otherwise the costs are relatively consistent. And then finally, if you're flying a long way to get to the Pacific Northwest, typically July and August are the most expensive months to fly. Number 6, the type of cruise line. All the major cruise lines have ships in Alaska, so there's lots and lots of choices for you. Each brand has its own unique flavor, but the cruise lines fall into 3 broad categories. First, there's mass market ships. These are the big ship lines. These will be your most cost-effective options, but those big ships are limited as to where they can go in Alaska simply because the ships themselves are so large. In many cases, these ships will hold between 2,000 and 6,000 people. There's also small ship ocean cruises. These ships would have 1,000 guests or fewer, and some with as few as 300 people on board. The upside to these ships is their ability to get into the more remote places in Alaska and the higher quality shipboard experience with more inclusions. You will also, however, pay more to get on board. Finally, expedition ships. There is some blurring of the lines between the small ship category and the expedition ship category, but expedition ships have more active options like sea kayaking, zodiac boating, and hiking and walking when you're on shore. These cruise lines have between 50 and 300 people on board, and they visit the more remote parts of Alaska and often are conducting scientific research on board that guests can participate in. Regardless of which of these 3 types of cruises that you choose, you should expect it to cost more than a megaship cruise out of Florida. Nothing is that cheap. As a general rule of thumb, the smaller the ship, the more it's going to cost you. To guide your choices here, I would consider which cruise lines you've traveled with previously, what you liked or perhaps didn't like about that particular cruise line. Here's a bit of a summary of each of these buckets of cruise lines. In the big ship category, we would place Carnival, Celebrity, Cunard, Disney, Holland America, Norwegian, Princess, and Royal Caribbean. In the big ship category, Holland America and Princess really do dominate the Alaska market. In a normal season, each of those cruise lines will have 7 ships there. The other cruise lines have between 1 and 3 ships. In the small ship cruise line category, there's Explorer Journeys, Oceania, Regent, Seabourn, Silversea, Viking Ocean, and Windstar. These cruise lines have between 300 and 900 guests, have varying inclusions, but are generally more inclusive and of a higher quality than the big ship cruise lines. In the expedition cruise line category, we have American Queen Voyages, Hurtigruten, Lindblad, and Uncruise. We should also mention here that Silversea does have an expedition ship in Alaska, and Seabourn does have some expedition options off their regular ship in Alaska. Comparing the individual cruise lines is a bit longer conversation, and we're happy to have that discussion with you, but we won't be going into that depth here. Contact us at the coordinates below and we can help you narrow your options down further. And finally, number 7, Seattle or Vancouver. People tend to agonize about whether to go to Seattle or Vancouver as the southern point of their cruise. For the record, there's also Alaska cruises from both LA and San Francisco as well, but let's put those aside for just a minute. In reality, Seattle and Vancouver are only 100 miles apart, even though it seems like more because there's an international boundary separating them. It's really easy to travel between the two cities, either by plane, it's about a 20-minute ride, motor coach, which will take 3 to 4 hours, including border crossing time. And in my opinion, the best way to get between the two cities is Amtrak. Yep, the Amtrak, it actually goes all the way to Vancouver and a few other Canadian cities. The Amtrak goes a few times a day between Seattle and Vancouver, and most of that rail journey is actually right on the ocean. The border crossing procedure when you're on the train is actually fairly easy. Customs and immigration come on board the train to process you, so it's fast and fairly easy. So the bottom line is I don't see a significant advantage to either one of these cities over the other. You're going to need a passport either way, and both cities are well worth a visit if you have not been there previously. I should also mention that lots of people use Seattle-Tacoma Airport even if they're sailing out of Vancouver. Seattle is quite a bit better served than Vancouver for domestic flights, domestic inside the United States flights, and they can often be cheaper to fly into Seattle than Vancouver. So lots of people will fly into Seattle and then take the Amtrak or one of the other methods I mentioned to get up to Vancouver to catch their ship. And finally, a quick comment on the Alaska departures from either San Francisco or Los Angeles. These are great for people that either live in California or those that really love sea days, because there will be a lot of them. It takes about 3 days on the open ocean to get from California up to the Seattle-Vancouver area. And you're not on the coast. You are rather in the shipping lanes that are about 10 miles offshore. So you won't be seeing much for those 3 days. Again, these are great if you love sea days. If you're hoping to catch the spectacular West Coast scenery along the California, Oregon, and Washington coasts, that's not available on these cruises that leave from California and go to Alaska. So there it is, the 7 questions you need to consider before taking a trip to Alaska. This should help you narrow down your choices from hundreds of options to just a handful of cruise or land cruise options. If you need help narrowing down your options further, our contact information is in the notes below. If you enjoyed this video, then please give us a thumbs up, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you'd like to book a cruise to Alaska or really any other small ship, ocean, river, or expedition cruise, then we'd love to help you out. Our contact information is in the notes below. Thanks for watching.